Alabama, 1840. The land stretched wide, endless and white, blanketed with cotton that shimmered beneath the burning southern sun. From a distance, the fields looked almost serene, like a sea of purity swaying in the wind. But step closer, and the illusion shattered. Every stalk was stained with sweat, every row watered with tears. For behind the white softness lay a cruelty that pulsed like a hidden heartbeat through the soil. This was the world of the plantation. A world where one man's wealth was built upon the bent backs of hundreds. A world where silence itself was enforced with the crack of a whip. The overseer's voice carried like thunder, barking orders, reminding every soul in the field of their place. The master of this land ruled not only with law, but with fear. He walked through his fields in tall boots, his shadow stretching long across the rows. His presence alone was enough to silence whispers, to make hardened men lower their eyes, and women bow their heads. He was a king in his own kingdom, and he wanted everyone, enslaved or free, to know it. Yet beyond the fields, the house rose like a fortress. White columns, polished wood, and sprawling porches gave the illusion of nobility, but its walls carried secrets. Every nail, every brick, every room whispered of power, of dominance, and of control. The master's wife, draped in fine dresses and jewels, moved through its halls as though she were a queen. She looked down upon the enslaved with cold detachment, her eyes sharp, her voice quick to cut. To her they were tools, living instruments meant to serve, obey, and never be seen as human. But beneath her finery something else stirred. Something she tried to bury beneath the lace and silk. Loneliness, isolation. Even in the grandeur of the mansion, she lived in a cage of silence. Her husband's power extended over her too. To the world, she was his wife. In reality, she was little more than another possession, expected to smile at dinners, to maintain appearances, and to serve as the flawless mistress of the estate. In the fields, the enslaved knew this as well. They saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her smile cracked when she thought no one was watching. They heard her pacing footsteps echo late into the night. The house slaves, those who tended to her clothing, her meals, her rooms, spoke of her restlessness in whispers. She was not happy, but in this world, unhappiness meant nothing. The plantation lived and breathed on control. The master's word was law, and his wife's duty was to obey it. Yet as the cotton grew taller that summer, so too did the shadows creeping within the mansion. Shadows of secrets, of whispered desires, of a fire that could not be contained. In the silence of the fields, the enslaved people worked without complaint. Their hands bled, their backs bent, their lives suspended in endless servitude. They knew better than to speak openly of what they saw. They knew the price of rebellion, the cost of stepping out of line. Still they watched. They always watched, because even here, beneath the crushing weight of slavery, human eyes remained sharp. And those eyes began to notice things, the mistress slipping away in the evenings, her carriage rides lasting longer than necessary. The strange presence of men who did not belong to the household. A storm was gathering, the kind of storm that didn't show itself in thunderclouds or lightning, but in whispers carried across rooms, in suspicious glances exchanged in passing. A storm that would break not with rain, but with blood and humiliation. And deep within the plantation master's house, the first sparks of betrayal had already been lit. The mistress had a secret, one that would not stay hidden forever, one that, when uncovered, would bring a punishment so cruel, so public, that even the enslaved, those who had suffered unspeakable torment, would hesitate before carrying it out. For in Alabama, 1840, power was everything. And when power was challenged, the punishment had to be absolute. The cotton fields swayed silently that day, as though waiting. The wind carried no laughter, no song, no life, only the heavy silence of people who knew that their world, brutal as it already was about to descend into something far darker. Inside the grand plantation mansion, silence was both a luxury and a curse. The walls were lined with portraits of stern ancestors, each face staring down with judgmental eyes as though daring anyone to betray the family name. The mistress of the house walked through those halls like a ghost, her footsteps muffled against the polished wood. By day, she was draped in silks, her posture perfect, her words clipped and precise. To the outside world, she was untouchable, a woman who had everything. But at night, the truth revealed itself. Her husband, the plantation master, was a man consumed by work, wealth, and domination. His presence was heavy, suffocating, and his affections were scarce. To him, his wife was an ornament, a symbol of status. A beautiful face to greet guests, a flawless figure to stand by his side during church services, a keeper of appearances. Beyond that, he gave her little warmth. Loneliness grew inside her like a creeping vine. The long nights stretched endlessly as she sat at the window, staring at the flickering lanterns in the distant slave quarters. She could hear laughter there sometimes, hushed and fleeting, even amidst suffering. She envied it. Her own world was filled with silence, with coldness, with the weight of expectation. And so the mistress sought something forbidden. It began with glances. A fleeting look exchanged in the garden, the kind of look that lingered just a moment too long. Perhaps it was the overseer, a man trusted by her husband to manage the labor of the fields. Perhaps it was a tradesman, someone who visited the estate under the guise of business. Whoever it was, he was dangerous. His presence stirred something she had buried, the ache to be seen, not as a possession but as a woman. The affair unfolded slowly, cloaked in secrecy. Hidden letters slipped between books, footsteps soft upon the back staircase, the faint brush of hands as she passed him in the shadows of the stable. Each meeting was a defiance, each kiss a rebellion against the prison of her life. But in Alabama, 1840, such a betrayal was not just scandal, it was deadly. The enslaved staff in the house noticed things first. They saw her disappear at odd hours, her hair slightly undone, her cheeks flushed. They heard the faint creak of doors opening where none should be. They exchanged knowing glances but said nothing. To speak aloud was dangerous. To know too much was a curse. Still, whispers moved quietly among them. The mistress was playing a dangerous game, and the cost would be unimaginable if her secret was uncovered. The affair gave her moments of fleeting joy. For the first time in years, she laughed. She spoke in hushed tones, her voice trembling with excitement. She felt alive again, as though some piece of her had been awakened from death. But behind every stolen moment lurked the shadow of her husband's wrath. The plantation master was not a man to forgive betrayal. His entire empire was built upon obedience, control, and fear. To be defied was to be weakened, and weakness was something he could never allow. If word of her affair reached him, she knew her life would be over. If not her life, then the life of her lover. And perhaps the lives of the enslaved who had seen too much. But secrets have a way of surfacing. It happened one night when her husband returned earlier than expected from a business trip. He entered the house without warning, his boots echoing like thunder through the halls. He knew his home too well, every sound, every smell, and something felt wrong. The silence was broken by the faint creak of a door upstairs, the hurried shuffle of footsteps. He followed. His heart was not racing, it was cold, steady, murderous. The master was not a man prone to outbursts of passion. His anger was a blade, sharpened over time, wielded with precision. And now that blade was drawn. He pushed open the door to his wife's private chamber. The sight before him was confirmation of every suspicion. The mistress, her dress loosened, her hair falling around her face, froze in terror. Her lover, half-dressed, eyes wide with panic, stumbled back as though he had seen death itself. For in the doorway stood the master of the plantation, his figure framed in darkness, his expression unreadable. The silence that followed was suffocating. No words, no excuses could fill the void. The betrayal was complete, undeniable, irreversible. The lover tried to flee, but the master moved with cold swiftness, seizing him like prey. There was no shouting, no dramatic outburst, only a chilling calm. The mistress fell to her knees, begging, pleading for mercy, but her husband's eyes never left hers. He did not strike her. He did not kill the man where he stood. Instead, he dragged her lover from the room, his voice low, controlled, promising punishment beyond imagination. The mistress was left trembling, her tears staining the floor, knowing that her world had ended in that instant. The next morning the plantation felt different. The enslaved whispered among themselves, sensing the storm that had broken loose. The overseer was gone. His quarters were empty, his belongings vanished. No one spoke of where he had gone or whether he still lived. All that remained was the mistress, her face pale, her hands shaking, her eyes hollow, and yet her husband said nothing. Days passed in silence. He carried on with business as though nothing had changed. But beneath the surface he was waiting, planning. His punishment would not be swift, it would be unforgettable. For betrayal in his mind could not simply be punished. It had to be displayed. The mistress knew nothing yet of the horror he was about to unleash. But deep down she felt it, in the way he looked at her, in the silence that followed her every move, in the certainty that her fate was sealed. The affair had been her secret rebellion. But now it had become her noose. The plantation master was not a man of sudden tempers. His fury did not flare and vanish like fire. It smoldered, silent and controlled, waiting for the right moment to consume everything around it. After discovering his wife's betrayal, he did not shout. He did not beat her, nor did he storm through the halls in rage. He did something far more terrifying. He remained calm. That calmness unsettled everyone. For days he spoke little. He ate at the long wooden table alone, the mistress sitting across from him, her hands trembling as she tried to lift a spoon to her lips. He asked no questions, gave no accusations. His silence was heavier than any scream. His wife, once proud and commanding, could not meet his eyes. Every moment in his presence was torture, a slow unraveling of her nerves. The enslaved who worked inside the mansion noticed the change. The air itself seemed tense, as though the very walls held their breath. The master walked the corridors at night, his boots echoing like a steady drumbeat. He paused often at his wife's chamber door. Sometimes he would open it without a word, staring at her in silence before walking away. Each time she grew more fragile, more hollow, but his quiet was not mercy. It was calculation. He had built his world on control, over his land, his slaves, his wealth, and most importantly, his household. His wife's betrayal was more than a personal wound. It was an insult to his authority, a fracture in the image of perfection he projected to neighbors, business partners, and rival planters. To let her sin pass unnoticed would be weakness, and weakness in a land ruled by power could never be forgiven. Killing her lover had been simple. A body could vanish in the swamps, in the woods, in the endless cotton rows where no one dared ask questions. But his wife was different. She had humiliated him, defied him, made a mockery of his household. Her punishment could not be hidden. It had to be public, visible, unforgettable, and in his mind, there was only one way to achieve that. He would strip her of everything she held above others. Her pride, her dignity, her untouchable status as mistress of the house. And he would do it in the most twisted way possible. He would let the enslaved punish her. The idea was not born from compassion nor from justice. It was born from cruelty. To give those she had treated as animals the authority to strike her would humiliate her beyond measure. To stand helpless before them, the same people she had ordered about with sharp words and colder eyes, would destroy her pride. The master imagined it carefully, the yard filled with slaves, the mistress brought forward, trembling, forced to endure their hands, their judgment. He would not just avenge his own honor, he would turn her punishment into a lesson to her, to his slaves, and to every soul who heard the story. In the days that followed, preparations were made. The overseers were instructed to gather everyone in the central yard. Word spread quickly among the enslaved. Something was coming. Fear rippled through the quarters. No one understood the reason, but they all sensed it was tied to the mistress. Some dared to whisper about her affair. Others kept silent. Whatever the truth, the air thickened with dread. The mistress, too, felt it closing in. She tried to reason with her husband, falling to her knees in the privacy of his study. Her tears streamed onto the wooden floor as she begged for forgiveness, promising obedience, silence, anything. He stood over her, unmoved, his expression carved from stone. When she reached for his hand, he pulled it away. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low, controlled, chilling. "You disgraced me in my own house. Now I will disgrace you before everyone." Her breath caught, but he was already walking away. The finality of his tone left no doubt. Her fate was sealed. On the appointed day, the sun rose mercilessly over the plantation. The enslaved were summoned to the yard one by one until the space was filled with bodies. Men, women, children, no one was spared from witnessing what was about to unfold. The atmosphere was heavy, a silence pressing down upon them all. They exchanged uneasy glances, their eyes darting toward the big house, waiting. At last the master appeared. He descended the steps with slow, deliberate strides, his cane tapping the wood, his gaze sharp. Behind him, flanked by two overseers, came the mistress. She was pale, her once immaculate dress wrinkled, her hair undone. She moved like someone already condemned, her steps unsteady, her eyes wide with terror. The crowd shifted uneasily. The enslaved looked from her to the master, confusion and fear knotting their stomachs. Never before had they seen the mistress in such a state. She was the untouchable figure of the house, the one who scolded, commanded, punished in her own right. And now she stood trembling, vulnerable before them. The master raised his hand for silence, though none dared speak. His voice carried across the yard, measured and cold. "My wife has betrayed me. She has brought shame into my house, shame upon my name. Such sin cannot go unanswered." The mistress cried out, "Please, not like this." But he silenced her with a single glance, then he turned to the crowd of slaves. His next words froze their blood. "You will punish her. You will be her executioners. And you will do so here before us all." Gasps rippled through the gathered people. Some lowered their heads, others glanced nervously at one another. It was unthinkable. To lay hands on the mistress, even under command, was a death sentence in any other circumstance. To refuse now was just as dangerous. The trap was perfect. Obedience meant unthinkable guilt. Refusal meant death. The mistress screamed, falling to her knees, her voice breaking. "Please, they are slaves, they are beneath me." The master's face hardened. "And today, they are above you." The yard was silent, save for her sobs. The slaves stood frozen, caught between terror and something darker, something long buried beneath chains and lashes. For the first time, they were given power, twisted as it was. And the mistress who had lorded over them was now at their mercy. The stage was set. The punishment was about to begin. The yard was silent, yet the silence was louder than any scream. Hundreds of eyes were fixed upon the mistress, who knelt trembling on the ground, her sobs cutting through the heavy air. The master stood tall, his gaze sweeping across the crowd of enslaved men and women who had been summoned to witness this twisted judgment. "Do as I command," he said, his voice carrying like a whip crack, but the enslaved did not move. They stood frozen, their hands clenched, their hearts pounding. To strike the mistress, the woman who had ordered their punishments, who had belittled them, who had reminded them daily of their chains, was unthinkable. Not because they feared hurting her, but because they feared him. The master's command was a trap, a test of obedience twisted into cruelty. If they refused, they would die. If they obeyed, they might live, but at the cost of their own souls. Among them, whispers stirred. A mother clutched her child's hand tighter, shielding his eyes. An old man bowed his head, murmuring a prayer under his breath. Younger men shifted uneasily, their jaws tight with both fear and a strange forbidden hunger for revenge. The mistress, her face streaked with tears, cried out to the crowd, "You will not touch me. You wouldn't dare. I am your mistress." Her words, meant to remind them of their place, only deepened the silence. For years they had endured her cruelty, her sharp tongue, her disdain, the punishment she had ordered without a shred of compassion. And now, for the first time, she was powerless. The master raised his cane, pointing toward her. "Begin," he commanded. Still no one moved. The weight of the moment pressed down on them like a suffocating fog. To raise a hand against her felt like stepping into a pit from which there was no escape. The overseers shifted uneasily, their eyes flicking between the slaves and the master. At last, one man stepped forward. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face weathered by years of labor under the burning sun. His name was Josiah. His hands were scarred, his back marked with lashes that the mistress herself had once ordered. He looked at her now, and something long buried stirred inside him. The mistress shrieked at him. "Don't you dare! Don't you touch me!" His eyes flicked to the master, who gave a small nod. Josiah's chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. Slowly he bent down and picked up the whip that had been laid upon the ground. A whip meant for his own flesh, now placed in his hands for her. The crowd watched in horror. The roles had been reversed. The mistress crawled backward, shaking her head violently. "No, no, please. Not by them. Not by slaves." But Josiah stepped closer. His hand trembled as he gripped the whip, his mind torn between fear and rage. For years he had been forced to endure the sting of that very leather, to hear her cold voice call for his punishment. And now she was at his mercy. His first strike cracked through the air like thunder. The sound echoed across the yard, sending a shiver through every witness. The mistress screamed, collapsing forward onto the dirt. The crowd gasped, some in shock, some in grim silence. The master's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Again," he ordered. Josiah hesitated, his chest heaving, his soul twisting in torment. Then, with tears burning in his eyes, he raised the whip once more. The lash fell, sharp and merciless. Each strike tore at him as much as it tore at her. His body obeyed, but his spirit bled. The mistress wailed, her voice raw, begging for mercy. She turned her tear-stained face to the crowd, her words broken. "Please, you know me. I am your mistress." But her pleas fell into silence. None dared step forward to help her. None could. They were trapped in the master's cruel theater, forced to participate in a punishment that twisted both victim and executioner. As Josiah faltered, the master's eyes swept over the crowd. "You," he barked, pointing to another, a woman this time, her hands rough from years of washing and cooking, her eyes wide with terror. She shook her head, but the overseer's glare silenced her protest. Trembling, she approached. The whip was thrust into her hands, her knees buckled, her grip unsteady. But the master's voice left no room for hesitation. "Do it." The woman closed her eyes, her tears falling as she obeyed. The lash struck weakly at first, but the mistress's screams filled the yard nonetheless. Each sound seemed to carve itself into the hearts of the enslaved, leaving scars that would never fade. One by one, he called them forward. Men and women alike, some struck with trembling hands, others with a quiet, buried rage. Each blow was both a release and a wound, a moment of stolen power twisted into torment by the master's command. The mistress's voice grew hoarse, her body crumpling beneath the weight of humiliation. Her finery was torn, her dignity shattered. She was no longer the queen of the plantation. She was a spectacle, broken and exposed before the very people she had despised. And through it all, the master watched with cold satisfaction. To him, this was not just punishment, it was theater, a demonstration of his absolute control. He had turned his wife's betrayal into a public ritual, ensuring that no one, slave or free, would ever forget it. The enslaved returned to their places in the crowd, their hands shaking, their eyes haunted. Some avoided looking at her, ashamed of what they had been forced to do. Others stared, unable to hide the flicker of vengeance that had lived too long in their hearts. But all of them carried the same dread. What would come next? Would their participation save them, or would it mark them for future cruelty? The master's games were never without cost. The mistress lay in the dirt, her sobs fading into ragged breaths. Her once immaculate figure was reduced to a trembling, broken body. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked into silence. The master finally raised his hand, signaling the end. "Enough," he said. The yard remained silent, the echoes of the lashes still hanging in the air. The enslaved stood in heavy stillness, their hearts torn between guilt and grim satisfaction. The mistress lay still, humiliated before them all. And yet, everyone knew this was not the end. This was only the beginning of something darker, something that would stain the memory of the plantation forever. The sun had begun to sink low, casting long shadows across the yard. What had begun as a brutal humiliation was about to transform into something far worse. A spectacle. The master, standing tall on the porch of the grand house, surveyed the gathering with a calculating gaze. His wife lay in the dirt, her sobs muffled, her body broken. But to him this was not enough. Private punishment satisfied his fury, but it was the public memory he sought, the story that would outlive the moment, whispered across every field and household, binding fear tighter than chains ever could. He lifted his cane high, striking it against the wooden rail of the porch. "Bring them forward," he ordered. At once the overseers moved among the enslaved, herding men, women, and even children closer to the yard's center. No one would be excused from witnessing. Every pair of eyes, young or old, would carry the memory of what was about to unfold. The mistress, hearing the shuffle of feet around her, stirred weakly. She tried to lift her head, but her body betrayed her. Her once proud hair hung loose and tangled, her gown soiled with dust and torn fabric. She no longer resembled the lady of the house. She looked like prey. The master's voice rang out steady and cold. "Today you will remember what happens when loyalty is broken. You will remember what happens when shame is brought to this household. And you," his gaze swept across the enslaved, "you will remember that even in punishment your role is obedience." A bench was dragged forward into the yard. Heavy splintered wood, stained dark from years of use. It had held countless backs before, the weight of bodies bent beneath the lash. Now it was placed in the open, positioned not for secrecy, but for spectacle. The mistress let out a weak cry when she saw it. "No, not there. Please, not in front of them." But the master ignored her pleas. Two overseers lifted her by the arms, dragging her trembling frame to the bench. She kicked weakly, begged, sobbed, but their grip was iron. They forced her down, pressing her body across the wood, tying her wrists so she could not resist. The sound of the rope pulling tight sent a ripple through the gathered crowd. This was no longer mere punishment. It was theater. The master turned deliberately to the enslaved, his eyes scanning their faces. Some looked away, unable to meet his gaze. Others stared, hollow-eyed, numb from a lifetime of horrors. And yet there was something different in the air, a hushed tension, a mingling of fear and disbelief. "Choose another," the master ordered, pointing toward the crowd. His finger landed on a young man no older than 20. Thin from hunger, his hands calloused from endless picking, he stepped forward reluctantly. His name was Samuel. He shook his head at first, whispering, "Please, master, don't make me." But the overseer's hand struck his back, propelling him forward. The whip was placed in his hand. Samuel's body shook. He stared at the leather strap, the cruel instrument he had felt across his own back too many times to count. Now it lay heavy in his palm, demanding that he raise it against the woman who had once held command over his fate. His throat went dry. His heart pounded. The mistress screamed at him, her voice hoarse. "Don't you dare! You filthy—" Her words broke into a sob. "Please, please don't." Samuel's arm lifted slowly. The leather cracked through the air, landing across her back with a sound that silenced even the wind. Her scream pierced the yard, a jagged cry that sent children burying their faces into their mothers' skirts. The master nodded approvingly. Again. Samuel obeyed, his eyes closed, his lips trembling as silent tears ran down his cheeks. Each lash tore not only at the mistress, but at Samuel himself. He struck because he was ordered, but every blow carved another scar into his soul. When his arm could no longer rise, the whip was taken from him. The master pointed again. Another was chosen. Then another. The spectacle unfolded with chilling precision. One after another, the enslaved were forced into the role of executioner, each strike amplifying the mistress's humiliation. Some struck weakly, their arms trembling. Others, burning with a buried fury too dangerous to ever show, struck harder, each lash carrying years of silent rage. The mistress's cries turned from defiance to pleading. "I'm sorry. Please forgive me." Her voice broke, reduced to a pitiful whimper. She begged the very people she had once cursed and ordered about like animals. But no mercy could be given, not because they lacked it, but because mercy itself was forbidden. The yard became a stage of echoes, the crack of leather, the shrieks of pain, the gasps of the onlookers. Even the birds had gone silent, as if nature itself recoiled. The mistress's body sagged against the bench, her skin striped with welts, her sobs fading into broken gasps. And yet the master did not stop. He relished the performance, watching both wife and slaves degrade under the weight of his command. This was power in its rawest form, not the whip alone, but the forcing of victims to become executioners, binding them in guilt, fear, and silence. At last, he raised his hand. Enough! The whip fell still. The overseers untied the ropes, and the mistress crumpled to the dirt, unable to stand. She crawled weakly, her body shaking, her voice nothing but a cracked whisper. She looked not like the mistress of the house, but like one of the broken souls she had ruled over. The enslaved stood frozen. Some wept quietly. Some stared at the ground, unable to look at what they had done. A few, though, held their gaze steady, their faces unreadable, but their eyes carrying a glimmer of something dangerous, something the master failed to notice. The master looked over them all, his voice calm, deliberate. Let this be remembered. Betrayal brings ruin, disobedience brings death, and loyalty. Loyalty is tested through fire. He turned away, satisfied, leaving his wife broken in the dust and his slaves haunted by what they had been forced to do. The crowd dispersed slowly, like shadows retreating into the night. But none could escape the memory of what they had seen. The mistress's screams would echo in their minds. The whip, once the symbol of their suffering, had been turned against its mistress. The roles had shifted, if only for a moment, but the scars, on her and on them, would never fade. The plantation, once a place of routine cruelty, now carried a deeper silence. A silence that spoke of shame, of fear, and of a wound that would never heal. Night fell heavy over the plantation. The yard, where screams had echoed only hours before, now lay in silence. The shadows of the trees stretched long and thin, covering the blood-stained dirt as though trying to hide what had transpired. But no shadow could cover the memory of that day. The mistress lay in her chamber, but she no longer resembled the woman who once ruled it. Her skin bore welts like angry firebrands, each movement sending fresh waves of pain through her body. But worse than the wounds was the silence inside her. She no longer wept. She no longer raged. She stared blankly at the ceiling, her breath shallow, her eyes glassy. For years, she had lived as mistress of the house, wrapped in silk, carried by privilege, feared by the very people she now depended on. She had given orders with a sharp tongue, had wielded cruelty when it suited her, had seen herself as untouchable. And in a single afternoon, all of it had shattered. Every memory of the yard replayed endlessly in her mind. The faces of the enslaved, their eyes locked with hers as the whip cracked across her back. The humiliation was unbearable, but deeper still was the realization she was powerless. The woman who had believed herself superior was reduced to pleading with those she once scorned. The same voices that had once answered, "Yes, ma'am," now carried out her punishment with trembling hands. And the worst part, she had begged them for mercy, and none had come. Her pride had been stripped as mercilessly as her dignity. When the door creaked open, she flinched, expecting her husband's cold figure, but instead it was a house servant, an older woman who had tended to her for years, a woman she had scarcely acknowledged beyond commands. The servant brought water and bandages, laying them quietly by the bed. The mistress tried to speak but found her voice cracked, weak, unfamiliar. "Why?" she whispered. The servant did not answer. She did not meet her mistress's eyes. She only bowed her head as though ashamed, not for herself but for the world they all inhabited. And then the mistress realized, this woman too had watched. She had seen her downfall. She had seen her whipped and broken. The shame burned deeper than any lash. The days that followed dragged like endless nights. She refused food, her body wasting, her once glowing face hollow and gaunt. The whispers of the plantation carried through the walls. She heard them, faint but clear, the enslaved recounting the spectacle, the overseers speaking in hushed tones, the neighbors gossiping when they came to visit. Her name had become a curse. Alone in her chamber, the mistress spoke to herself in whispers, her mind splintering under the weight of disgrace. Sometimes she cursed her husband, vowing revenge that she had no power to claim. Sometimes she cursed the enslaved, hating them for obeying his command. Other times she cursed herself for daring to seek love, for daring to feel human in a world that allowed her nothing beyond obedience to her husband's cold rule. The woman who had once walked the halls with poise now stumbled like a prisoner in her own home. She covered her face when servants passed, unable to endure their silent stares. She clawed at the mirrors in her room until the glass cracked, unable to face the reflection of what she had become. At night, the screams returned, not from her lips, but in her dreams. She woke drenched in sweat, her throat raw, her hands shaking violently. She saw Samuel's face, the first young man forced to whip her. She saw his tears as he struck her, and in her delirium she heard him whisper, "Now you know." The plantation master observed her decline with detached satisfaction. He did not comfort her, nor did he punish her further. To him, the silence of her collapse was proof of victory. He had broken her more completely than any blade or bullet could have. She was a lesson now, a living monument to betrayal. But the mistress herself was trapped in a limbo between madness and despair. She could no longer function as wife or mistress. She drifted through her days like a shadow, muttering half-formed thoughts, clutching at unseen hands. At times she begged the servants to forgive her, falling to her knees weeping, but their silence only deepened her shame. At other times, she raged, screaming at them with the last remnants of her old cruelty, but even that burned out quickly, leaving her sobbing on the floor. Her husband never struck her again. He didn't need to. The punishment lived on in her, festering like an infection. One afternoon she stumbled into the garden barefoot, her gown dragging through the dirt. The enslaved working the fields paused, watching her wander aimlessly among the roses. She tore at the flowers with trembling hands, pressing the thorns into her skin until her palms bled. "See," she whispered to no one, "even beauty bleeds." By the time she was carried back to her room, her hands shredded and her face streaked with tears, it was clear to all the mistress was no longer whole. Her mind had fractured. The humiliation had not only stripped her of dignity, it had devoured her sanity. And though she still breathed, still moved, still haunted the halls of the mansion, she was no longer the woman she had once been. She had become something else, a living ghost. The plantation returned to its grim rhythm. Cotton still needed to be picked, fields still had to be tended, and work did not stop, no matter how heavy the silence that lingered. But beneath the surface, the enslaved carried a new weight, one heavier than chains, heavier than whips. They had been forced into roles that twisted the very meaning of survival. They had been executioners of their mistress. For generations they had endured cruelty. They had seen overseers whip their kin until the flesh tore, had watched mothers weep as children were taken from them, had suffered hunger, heat, and endless labor. But never before had they been made to punish one of them. Never before had the lash been placed in their hands, not against their own flesh, but against the woman who had ruled them. It was a burden none could escape. Samuel, the first chosen, could not sleep. Every night he woke drenched in sweat, hearing her cries echoing in his ears. He replayed the moment when his arm had lifted, when the leather cracked, when she screamed his name, not in authority but in begging. He had struck because he had to, but the guilt gnawed at him. It was as if he had become part of the master's cruelty. His own hand turned into a weapon against another soul. Others whispered in the quarters after dark. They spoke in hushed voices, careful of listening ears. Some felt shame, others a grim satisfaction. One older man, bent from years of labor, said, "He made us punish her, so he could punish us too. Don't think it was just her back that bled. It was all of us." Some nodded. Others stared into the fire, silent. A few, however, admitted something darker. They had struck harder than they needed to. Years of humiliation at her hands, years of insults and beatings, years of being treated as less than animals. Some had let their buried rage spill into each lash. And yet, instead of relief, it had left them hollow, frightened by the glimpse of their own anger. One woman who had been forced to watch with her children whispered, "He made us taste what he tastes. Now we know the sickness that lives in him." For the enslaved, the spectacle had been more than a punishment for the mistress. It was a message, a demonstration that their master could twist them into mirrors of himself. He had broken more than his wife. He had broken something inside them too. Still, beneath the guilt, beneath the fear, a new seed had been planted. For a fleeting moment they had seen their mistress fall. They had seen the woman who once wielded power reduced to pleading, begging, powerless before them. They had been made to harm her, yes, but in that moment they realized she could bleed just like them. She could suffer. She could be broken. It was a dangerous revelation. Around the fires at night, whispers carried through the quarters. What if the master could be broken too? What if all his power was not as eternal as it seemed? They spoke carefully, never in full sentences, never too loudly. But the thought lingered. The system was not invincible. If even the mistress could be brought low, then the entire order of things was not carved into stone. Yet fear clamped tight around those whispers. The master had meant the spectacle to be binding, and it worked. To disobey was still death. To resist was still impossible. And so they carried their secret thoughts like smoldering coals, hidden deep, too dangerous to let burn, too powerful to extinguish. Children, too young to understand, remembered the sight of the whip in their father's hands, the screams that tore through the air. They asked questions that mothers could not answer. Why did Papa hit her? Why did she scream like that? The mothers shushed them, rocking them to sleep, their own tears falling silently. They knew these children would never forget. They would carry the memory into adulthood, a scar passed from one generation to the next. For the enslaved, survival meant silence. Outwardly they carried on. They bowed their heads when spoken to. They worked the fields as always. They sang in hushed tones, prayed in whispers, and kept their eyes lowered. But inside, each carried their own version of that day. Some saw it as proof of their helplessness, that they could be used not only as tools of labor but as tools of cruelty. Others saw it as a crack in the foundation, a glimpse that those who ruled them were not untouchable, and all of them feared the future. Because the master had changed something fundamental. By forcing them to punish his wife, he had drawn them into his darkness. He had given them a role in his cruelty, ensuring that they too bore the stain of it. Now they carried the guilt and the fear, bound tighter to him than before. The yard where it had happened became a place they avoided. Even in daylight, they walked around it, unwilling to step where her screams had filled the air. Some said the ground itself carried the sound, that if you stood still in the night, you could hear the echoes rise again, but no echo was louder than the silence that followed. For while the master believed he had demonstrated his absolute control, the enslaved knew a truth he could not erase. They had seen the mistress fall. They had seen power humbled. And though fear kept them obedient, that memory would never die. It lingered in the air, in their bones, in their prayers, whispered to a God who seemed far away. And in that lingering memory, something dangerous grew. Not rebellion, not yet, but the knowledge that even the high could be dragged into the dirt. News does not stay buried on a plantation. No matter how tightly the master tried to control his domain, whispers were quicker than chains, swifter than overseers, and deadlier than any whip. Within days, what had happened in the yard began to travel. First in hushed tones among the enslaved who slipped word to neighboring fields, then carried by merchants, tradesmen, and visiting overseers. By the end of the month, it was more than rumor. It was scandal. The story was never told the same way twice. Some claimed the mistress had been caught with the overseer himself. Others swore it was a passing trader. Some said the lover had been shot on the spot. Others whispered he had been strung up and left hanging in the swamp. But one detail remained in every telling. The mistress had been punished by her own slaves, forced to feel the lash at the command of her husband. In the drawing rooms of Montgomery and Mobile, society women clutched their pearls, their voices dropping low as they repeated the tale. Can you imagine? To let slaves touch her, to whip her? To them, the act was not only barbaric, it was unthinkable. A mistress was supposed to represent refinement, the fragile jewel of Southern aristocracy. To reduce her to public degradation at the hands of those beneath her was an abomination. And yet, in men's circles, where cigars burned and whiskey flowed, the story carried a different tone. Some called the plantation master a genius of cruelty, a man who had found a punishment so twisted, so unforgettable, that it would be spoken of for decades. "He's shown them who's in control," one planter said, slamming his glass down with admiration. "Not only her, but the slaves too. They'll never forget he owns them all." But others shook their heads, disturbed. "He's a fool," one muttered. "He humiliated himself. To expose his wife, to make a spectacle of his own household. What does that say about him? That he can't control even his own bed?" In the rigid society of Alabama's planter class, reputation was everything. A wife's betrayal was shame enough. To broadcast it to the world was to admit weakness, to stain the family name in a way no wealth could erase. So the story spread in two voices, one praising the master's ruthlessness, the other mocking his pride. Either way, it became impossible to ignore. Among the enslaved across Alabama, the tale took on yet another life. For them, it was whispered proof that the world of their masters was not invincible, that even the women who strutted in lace and silk could be broken, that even the great masters of the South were not gods, but men filled with anger, pride, and sickness. The story became a kind of forbidden parable, told around campfires and in whispered hymns. "She screamed," they would say. "Just like us," she begged. "Just like us." And in those words, quiet seeds of rebellion were planted, not in open defiance, but in the dangerous thought that the world was not as unshakable as it seemed. Neighbors of the plantation began to circle like vultures, some with sympathy, others with suspicion. Women visited under the guise of bringing comfort to the mistress, but behind their polite smiles, they searched her eyes, hungry for signs of her disgrace. They wanted to see the cracks in her, to measure how far she had fallen. The mistress, however, no longer met their gaze. She hid in her chambers, refusing to appear at social gatherings, her name spoken more often in scandal than in sympathy. Once she had been envied for her fine gowns, her grand home, her place beside one of the wealthiest men in Alabama. Now she was spoken of as a cautionary tale, a woman who had betrayed her station and been made to pay in the most grotesque way imaginable. The master himself seemed unaffected. He carried on with business as though nothing had happened. Cotton still left his fields in great bales. Money still flowed. He greeted neighbors with the same cold authority, his face unreadable. But behind closed doors he was listening. He knew the whispers, knew the way men laughed over whiskey and women shook their heads over tea. And though he never showed it, each rumor cut him as deeply as a blade. His plan had been to assert dominance, to display control. But in the court of Southern reputation, he had instead exposed his household as tainted. Some said he had lost control of his wife. Others claimed he had lost control of himself. And in a world built upon appearances, that was nearly as damning as betrayal itself. Still, the story endured. In every town square, in every tavern, in every slave quarter, the tale was retold and reshaped, embroidered with new details until it became legend. It was no longer just about a woman punished for her sins. It was about power, how it was used, how it was abused, and how even the highest walls could crack. In hushed tones, some began calling the master's yard the theater of shame. Others whispered of the chamber of secrets hidden in Alabama's plantations. The unspoken violences, the buried scandals, the truths that polite society pretended did not exist. The mistress's name was no longer spoken with admiration, but with a mix of pity and disdain, and as the months wore on, her story spread further, carried along the rivers and roads, until even those who had never seen the plantation spoke of her as though they had witnessed the spectacle themselves. The South thrived on silence, on keeping certain truths buried. But this story was too grotesque, too powerful, too haunting to be buried. It clung to the air like smoke, a reminder of the sickness festering beneath the polished veneer of cotton and wealth. And for the mistress herself, the whispers became a second punishment, one she could not escape, no matter how tightly she closed her chamber door. The walls of the Grand Plantation home had once been her kingdom. She had glided across polished floors in gowns imported from New Orleans, her laughter echoing through parlors lit with crystal chandeliers. She had been the hostess, the belle, the ornament that crowned her husband's empire. But now, those same walls felt like a prison. The mistress no longer descended the staircase. She no longer joined the dinners where guests pretended nothing had happened. She ate alone, if she ate at all, her food carried upstairs by a silent house slave who dared not look her in the eyes. The curtains of her chamber were drawn tight against the Alabama sun, and in the stale dim light she withered. Her hair, once carefully tended by enslaved women who brushed it smooth each morning, grew tangled and unkempt. Her gowns hung loose on her frame as the pounds fell away. She spent hours before the mirror, not admiring her reflection, but staring into it with wide, fevered eyes, as though she no longer recognized the woman gazing back. Sometimes she whispered to herself. Sometimes she screamed. At night, the house echoed with her cries. Servants whispered that she woke shrieking, clawing at her own skin as though trying to peel away the memory of the lash. One claimed she tore her nails bloody against the bedposts. Another swore she had been seen wandering the halls half-dressed, muttering names no one knew. Her husband never came to her. He slept in a separate room, his cold silence sharper than any whip. To him she was a problem dealt with, a lesson carved into flesh. Yet as the scandal spread across Alabama, he found himself resenting her all the more. In his mind, she was the reason for his shame. The weak, faithless woman who had brought laughter and whispers upon his name. The mistress's world shrank smaller and smaller. Former friends stopped calling. Invitations ceased. Neighbors crossed the road rather than face her hollow stare. She was still alive, but to Southern society, she was already a ghost, a woman erased by her own disgrace. By the third month, her health faltered. Fever swept through her body, leaving her weak and trembling. Some whispered it was consumption, others said it was madness eating her alive. The plantation's enslaved women tended her with quiet hands, cooling her forehead with damp cloths. Feeding her broth she barely swallowed. There was no pity in their eyes, only the cold, distant duty of those forced into service. To them, she was just another mistress, only now stripped of the power that had once cloaked her, yet at times, in her delirium, she begged them to speak with her. She grasped at their arms with trembling fingers, whispering, "You know me. You saw me suffer. You must understand I was not always cruel." But they only lowered their eyes because what answer could they give? That they had seen her laugh while the whip fell on others? That they remembered every command, every punishment she had approved? She wanted absolution, but no one on that plantation could grant it. Her dreams grew darker. She swore she saw the faces of slaves looming at the foot of her bed, their eyes burning with hatred, their hands reaching for the whip. She saw her husband too, standing in the corner of the room, smiling with satisfaction as the cycle repeated again and again. Night after night she woke drenched in sweat, choking on her own sobs. By the end of summer, the mistress was hardly more than a shadow. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her voice was faint, cracked, almost childlike. The once proud woman who had ordered slaves to serve her every whim could no longer command even her own body. And then came the final decline. One morning she did not rise from bed. The enslaved maid who entered found her pale and trembling, her breath shallow. Her lips moved, forming words, but they were incoherent, half prayers, half confessions. Some swore they heard her whisper the name of the man she had loved, as though calling him into the room to claim her soul. Her husband was summoned. For the first time in months, he stood at her bedside, his face carved in stone. She reached for him with fragile fingers, desperate for a touch, a word, a sign that she was not utterly abandoned. But he only looked down at her with a cold, unreadable stare. To him, she was already dead. That night, as thunder rolled over the Alabama fields, the mistress's breathing grew ragged. The enslaved women lit candles around her bed, their faces solemn but unmoved. She writhed against the sheets, gasping for air, as though still reliving the punishment that had broken her months before. And just before dawn, her body fell still. Some say she died of fever. Others whispered it was madness, that her own mind had devoured her. But among the slaves, the story became something different. that she had been claimed by the spirits of the yard, by the memory of lashes, by the cries of those she had once ignored. That her death was not an accident, but a reckoning. The master ordered no grand funeral. He buried her quietly without ceremony in a family plot, shaded by moss-draped oaks. No mourners filled the pews. No procession wound its way through town. She vanished from the world as quietly as she had been erased from its whispers. But her memory lingered, in gossip, in scandal, in the minds of the enslaved who had seen her fall. Her story became a warning, a ghostly reminder that the walls of the grand houses could not always protect those inside. And for her husband, the silence of her grave brought no peace. He had punished her to erase her betrayal, to restore his pride. But now he was left with nothing but emptiness, the wealth, the fields, the slaves, all surrounding him in cold obedience. But no companion, no wife, no redemption. The mistress's final days ended not with dignity but with decay, and her name, once spoken with admiration, would forever be bound to scandal, cruelty, and ruin. The fields did not pause for her death. Cotton still grew thick across the red Alabama soil, and the enslaved still rose before dawn to pluck it beneath a sky that did not care who lived or who died. The mistress's grave, marked by nothing more than a stone cross, blended into the shadows beneath the oaks as though the land itself had swallowed her. Yet whispers did not die with her. They spread like smoke through the county, carried on tongues eager to retell the scandal. Some said the mistress had gone mad because of her own sins, that her death was God's punishment for infidelity. Others whispered darker truths, that her husband had destroyed her spirit, that the punishment he staged had been too cruel even for a man of his station. Among plantation wives, her story became a hushed warning. Among slaves, it became a tale of strange, bitter justice. The master himself never spoke of her again. When guests visited the plantation, he entertained them with bourbon and politics, his booming laugh echoing through the halls. But his eyes, hard and cold, betrayed the silence at his side. No new wife took her place. No woman dared. His home became a hollow empire. Wealth without warmth, power without companionship. And the slaves? They remembered. For them, that day in the yard remained carved into memory like scars on skin. They had been forced into the role of executioners, torn between terror and fury. Some still woke at night with the sound of her screams in their ears, a sound mingled with all the others they had been forced to endure. But unlike those countless cries lost to the fields, this one was different. It belonged to the mistress. It belonged to power undone. Years later, when whispers of freedom began to stir, some among them retold the tale. Around fires, in hushed voices, they recalled the day the whip cracked not against their backs, but against hers. It was not triumph. They did not claim it as victory. But it was a moment, a fracture in the iron order of the South, when power was shown to be fragile, when cruelty devoured its own. Beyond the plantation, the story lingered in the drawing rooms of Alabama. Some planters muttered that the master had gone too far, that he had disgraced himself by airing his household shame before the very people meant to fear him. Others, darker still, praised his cruelty as genius, a warning to wives and slaves alike. In their minds, the public humiliation of his wife was not scandal, but strategy. But history does not remember strategy. It remembers scars. The mistress's downfall became part of a hidden tapestry of Southern life, the kind of story not written in newspapers or diaries, but carried in the marrow of memory. It was not just about adultery or punishment. It was about the sickness of a society built on domination, a world where betrayal was met not with silence but with spectacle, a world where cruelty was not an accident, but a tradition passed from father to son. And in that silence of her grave, the questions remained. Was the mistress a victim or complicit? Was she simply crushed by a husband's cruelty? Or had she reaped the echoes of the suffering she once oversaw? No one could answer. Perhaps both were true. Perhaps that was the cruelty of it all, that no one in the house of slavery could ever escape the poison it spread, not even those who believed themselves untouchable. The plantation itself endured for decades. Cotton kept pouring from its fields, carried on the backs of men and women who had no choice but to obey. The master grew older, grayer, more severe, but behind his name, behind his wealth, trailed the story of the woman he had destroyed. For every guest who raised a glass at his table, there was another who whispered behind his back. His power remained vast, but his legacy was rotted by what he had done. Time, however, has a way of eroding all things. The Civil War came, and with it, fire and ruin swept across the South. Plantations burned, chains broke, and the voices once silenced began to speak. Some who had been there that day lived to tell their grandchildren of it. How the mistress had screamed, how the master had smiled, how the soil had seemed to drink her shame. Generations later, the story became less about one woman and more about what she represented. Her humiliation stood as a symbol of the twisted power that had governed the South. It was a reminder that in a world built on cruelty, even those at the top could fall prey to its jaws. And so her memory became haunting. Not beloved, not mourned, but haunting. She lingered in the silence of the fields, in the creak of the great house, in the shadows of the trees that had watched her burial. For those who sought the truth of the South's past, her tale was a window, a glimpse into the darkness that respectability tried to hide. The legacy of cruelty was not just her husband's, it was not just hers. It belonged to the entire system, to the entire poisoned world of plantations and slavery, a world where human beings were broken, used, discarded, and where even those who believed themselves masters were never free from the rot of their own brutality. And so, when the cotton fields grew quiet and the voices of the enslaved were finally free to speak, her story became part of the chorus, not as a tale of pity but as a warning. A reminder that cruelty consumes everything it touches, that shame, once born, cannot be buried. In Alabama, the soil still holds secrets, graves without names, stories without justice, but among them, whispered on the wind that drifts through ruined plantations, is the echo of a woman's scream and the memory of a husband's cruelty. The plantation stands no more. The master lies in his own grave. The slaves who suffered found freedom in time. But the story lives on, etched into history as a testament to the sickness of power and the terrible price it demands. And so the tale closes, not with redemption, but with silence. A silence heavy enough to remind us that behind every grand house of the Old South, there were stories like this. Stories of betrayal, of punishment, of cruelty so deep it poisoned everyone it touched. The mistress is gone, the master is gone, the fields are gone, but the cruelty remains.